Hola, hola. That's all I can say. I'm Robby, and we're gonna have a little fun today. So, as you can see, we're here in Brazil. Well, you all live here, so this isn't probably that new for you, but it's new for me. This is my first time I've been south of the equator. So, thank you. Everybody's been really nice, and I appreciate all the hospitable. I'm having troubles speaking English now. All right, let's get on with the show. So, this is the Rails Foundation AMA, and I would like to have two wonderful people join me up on stage. We've got Amanda, who is the executive director of the Rails Foundation. Woo! Come all the way from Amsterdam. And then we also have Bruno Miranda, who is the senior vice president of, VP of engineering at Doximity. Woohoo! Thank you. All right, so this is how this is going to work. I'm asking your questions. So these are not. I might sneak a few questions in. We asked the audience or all the attendees to submit questions for us. Thanks to our wonderful hosts, they've helped translate them for me. I will try to ask as many of your questions as possible. Some of you had similar questions, so I've tried to combine them. So if your name is not mentioned, I apologize, but I've just tried to combine some questions that were kind of similar. And so with that, I think the first question we want to ask is, what is the Rails Foundation? So I'll pass it over to Amanda to give us a little bit of an update on that.
So for those who don't know, the Rails Foundation was launched and announced in November 2022. DHH reached out to several companies such as Cookpad, Doximity, GitHub, Shopify, with the idea of starting a foundation to support the Rails community and to further the message of the Rails core, what the Rails core is doing. So our founding members are these 8 members above. Each of these members has somebody who sits on the board of the foundation, such as Bruno. And then we're further supported by the contributing members, AppSignal, Cedar Code, Planet Argon, of course, with Robby. These are all companies that you'll also notice, Doximity, Shopify. These are companies that really believe in investing in Rails. You'll notice that they're all sponsors of this event as well. So they sponsor the foundation under the same premise. And basically our mission is to support the Rails community through improving the documentation, marketing, education, and events around Rails. Basically what all of these things are doing is improving how we talk about Rails, improving how we message Rails, and supporting the work and amplifying the work that the Rails core is busy doing. So as they're improving the framework and working to get it better and better and better, we want to make sure that our messaging is better, we're saying the right things, we're promoting Rails in the right way, through marketing, through events. And the two audiences that we're speaking to here, I think mostly, number one is senior developers like yourselves who've been using Rails for a long time. You'll need the documentation, and it's nice to have events. And then the other is, how do we welcome more people into Rails? And that's marketing and education. So those are the two kind of goals of this mission. Really quickly going through this, the documentation, it hasn't really been updated in a long time, the look and feel of it, and the content has organically grown over the 20 years that Rails has been out. So we're going through it one by one, the guides one by one, to refresh the content and update the design. I think 2 weeks ago we launched the new guides. It hadn't been touched since 2009, so to bring it into 2024, we improved the UX and the design of it, and that's live now on Edge Guides. Marketing is more just, we're not trying to sell anything, we're not trying to sell Rails, we're just trying to improve the messaging, make sure we're talking about Rails more, discussing Rails more, and amplifying the message, talking about the companies who are built on Rails, like Shopify, like Doximity, Planet Argon uses Rails for their clients. And of course, education. We have if anybody knows the tutorial that's on the website right now, it's building a blog. We're gonna revisit that again and create a new tutorial focused on Rails 8 default features. And we hope to have that launched after Rails 8 comes live, shortly after Rails 8. And of course, events. Rails World took place for the first time last year, and we want to have it every year. But we're also reaching out to other events to see how we can support. So that's kind of us in a nutshell, a long nutshell.
Thank you. Thank you. I also want to point out that Doximity is, as Amanda mentioned, sponsoring Tropical RB, but they're also sponsoring Rails Girls. Who's here going to be part of Rails Girls this weekend? Awesome. That's wonderful. All right, let's get to your questions. Let's start with the hard one. Amanda, anonymous. Which one of you is anonymous? Why? This is a tough one, actually. So why did we feel, or I'm reading it verbatim, why did you feel the need to make an org that duplicated a lot of what Ruby Central was already doing?
That's an interesting question that I've seen once in a while. And when I talk to Ruby Central, that's never something they ask, because I think we both understand that our missions are quite different. The Rails Foundation is specifically working on the documentation, events, and marketing of Rails specifically. Ruby Central is doing fantastic work for the greater community, other frameworks that are built on Ruby, and they're maintaining Ruby gems. So there's really not a lot of crossover there, but there's probably opportunity that we can work together in the future. That's
great. Yeah, I think about Ruby Central. Who here knows about Ruby Central? Kind of some of you. I get that some of you may not understand that there are some nonprofit organizations behind a lot of these initiatives. So we've got something like Ruby Gems, which all of our Rails apps rely on. There's a team behind that, and there's some funding that goes into helping maintain and pay for the hosting, just dealing with some of the updates and stuff like that. And there's a lot of volunteers that participate as well. But companies are investing in making sure that Ruby Gems stays up for us, because that would be horrible if it didn't, if it just went away one day. So, and then the Rails Foundation, necessarily, like the code-wise, are you working on code right now, or are you going to be working on any new features for Rails 8 yourself?
That would be a disaster. So that's not going to happen anytime soon.
But you know how to use Git? A little bit?
A little bit.
I don't think you're giving yourself enough credit.
Yeah, I don't. She has commit access to the Rails project, I think. All right, Bruno. Mateus asks, I see an effort coming from 37 Signals team to support mobile devices in Rails. Is it also in the plans for the foundation and core team to contribute to this issue or cause?
That's a big question. Well, I certainly will not speak for the core team here, or for 37 Signals for that matter. But I do love the work that 37 Signals is putting into making PWAs better. All the work on turboprop, prop shaft, all those utilities are paving the way for better progressive web apps. As far as the core team, I think if their companies and the members have interest in the need to use progressive web apps, I don't think that there's any reason why they wouldn't work on that. And I hope 37 Signals continues to build onto those frameworks and make Rails better for supporting native or native-like mobile apps, because it makes it better for all of us and all of our companies and the people that want to use it.
Yeah, at the Rails Core AMA at Rails World, kind of a similar topic came up, and I was, thinking about. There was a question that we asked the Rails Core team, and it was like, if developers want to contribute to the project and pitch new ideas for things, the general consensus was you should not work on hypothetical things, like solve real world problems, and then if you think that can be somehow helpful to the Rails project, then contribute, but they're not interested in like working on hypothetical problems. And I thought that was kind of so if you're curious about Rails core stuff, and there's some Rails core members here you can talk to about that, but that's just, if you're thinking about like, oh, it'd be cool to do that, but like, do you have a reason to actually do that, then don't necessarily start doing that.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think it might have been Eileen who talked about supporting multiple databases and building that into Rails. It needed to come from somewhere. It needed to be needed somewhere before they decided to actually spend the time on it. So that's a good point.
Quick question for the audience. Can you raise your hands if you used the Rails guides in the last month? Great. How many of you?
Nice.
Keep your hand up if you've seen the new design. Okay, that's great. Some good work. So you've been, Amanda has been the executive director of the Rails Foundation for a little over a year now. Congratulations, it's been a year. And you've So this is your performance review. So what have you accomplished? No, more seriously, I think back to, I had my first conversation with Amanda. We run a survey every couple of years at Planet Argon. We poll the Ruby on Rails community, ask a bunch of questions, and then we share that with everybody. And Amanda reached out and had asked, like, hey, can we talk about your survey? I have some curiosities. And I was like, oh no. They're gonna wanna change it all or take it away from me. But we had this really great conversation, and she didn't come to me and say, hey, would Planet Argon like to be a contributing member to Rails Foundation? But she started talking about like the goals of the foundation and some of the projects and initiatives that they're working on. And at the end of it, I'm like, so tell me more about how I can help. Like, can I give you some money? I want to invest in this. So, I, just wanted to compliment you on doing a lot of reach out, and you're constantly on podcasts and talking with different people and networking. So, my question for you, Amanda, is how would you describe the Ruby on Rails community, having been part of it for a little over a year now and not a developer?
I think a really good example is just before I was a part of the community, I studied at Lewagen, the boot camp. Nice. And right before I started, I had financially committed to it, and then I went online to see like what this Ruby on Rails was about. And one of the first videos I saw on YouTube was a video of why you shouldn't learn Rails. I was like, shoot, too
Rails
late
is
now.
dead.
Yeah. And then I was like, man, I've made a mistake. And then I was talking to two friends who happened to be ex-GitHub employees, and I mentioned the boot camp, and they said, oh, okay, so what are you gonna learn there? And I said, Ruby on Rails. And they went, oh, you're gonna love it for this reason and this reason and this reason. And they made me feel better in my decision. And I feel like that has been every person in the community that I've met since I started this job. So I think it's a really special community for that. It's very enthusiastic, and that's quite contagious.
That's great to hear. Ronald asks, what are the strategies to boost junior developers in order to make the community more united and strengthened?
That's a good question, and I think about that a lot. It's not in the mission of the foundation to do that, but there's ways that we can help, or at least show how we can help. So for instance, creating space and creating opportunities. There's a ton of people who could have made, for instance, the Rails World website really quickly, and senior developers who could like whip it up in no time. But we decided that that was a small project and an easy thing to give to junior developers to do, that they would have that on their portfolio. It's just a static site, but they were still really enthusiastic about it. And then so we're gonna do that probably every year. It takes more time, it takes more energy. Maybe the first version isn't always perfect, but it's a great opportunity and they appreciate it. And earlier today, we heard about the same situation that Cerdes and the Tropical RB team are doing with the platform here. We had a partnership with the Agency of Learning to create the Rails World app. So it takes more energy and it takes more effort, but if you create the space, it can happen. And also I want to mention two companies. One is Big Binary, who's a contributing member of the foundation. They're based in the US and India. And another is actually here in the audience, probably, Nicholas and Juan from GoGrow from Uruguay. They were both all the way in the back. So basically what they do is they work with junior developers, or at least university students, and they mentor them on their final project in Rails. So you're constantly creating new developers and being enthusiastic about Rails and teaching them that there's this opportunity for Rails. So I can only imagine how much effort and time that takes GoGrow to do and invest in the community, but they really want to invest in the community. So if you want that, like, it'll take an effort, but we can make it happen.
That's great. How many people here are would classify themselves as a junior developer? Who, keep your hand raised.
Also.
Yeah. Who here feels like they need a mentor? That should be everybody. It was a trick
There's some more
question.
senior developers as well.
Yeah. Well, if you saw someone's hand raised and you're interested in helping mentor or something, you should definitely go introduce yourself after this.
Well, real quick, I would also say for those of you who raised your hands and you consider yourself a junior developer, I think you made the right step by coming to an event like this. And it's the exposure, it's just talking with people who you aspire to learn from and find the right mentors and connect with the right people who can help you along the path. It doesn't have to be huge events like this, but just I got into the community a while ago, just going to events and going to meetups and just talking to different people. My first job doing Ruby was through someone I met at the meetup. So I can't emphasize enough how just having that exposure and going to events, and small, large, medium, doesn't matter. Just go and talk to everyone, because that's a huge entry point into becoming one day a very senior developer.
That's a good point. Can I say something about that as well? I think there's a gap after boot camps, for instance, of introducing people to the community. You learn the framework, but then the actual community is a whole different vibe. And the Luwagan team earlier was saying how exciting it was to be here. So if we could sort of get them at the point of, so after my boot camp, everybody wanted to then study Python. Like immediately they were ready to switch off of, not everybody, but I think if you then go to an event and get this kind of vibe that everyone has and the enthusiasm, then I think it's a lot easier to understand the value of Rails in the Ruby community as a whole.
I think that those are some really good suggestions there. At Planet Argon, we have interns almost every quarter, and we intentionally don't use that as a hiring process. We've decided that we will do internships every quarter. We'll have 2 people come in, usually out of a boot camp, and we tell them right away, like, you're here for 6 to 8 weeks, that's the end of the internship. We're not going to hire you because we have to make space for more interns to keep coming in. So that has built a culture where everybody on my team is used to mentoring people coming and going, and we're helping people work on adding some stuff to the portfolio. We're also giving them some career guidance and asking them about their resumes and their cover letters. And so if you want to help junior developers, there's a lot of different ways companies and individuals here can do that. And I think just wanted to share that as like another thing that you can do. So if you're interested in internships and you're like, I don't have time, I'm happy to talk with you and tell you that you do have time. Figure it out. Bruno, Jewel ask, what growth in market expectations do you see for Rails in the next 5 to 10 years?
Wow, that's another big question.
Okay.
Well, so I've been involved with Rails for almost 20 years at this point, and it never ceases to amaze me how solid of a foundation it has. So I think if you take the Rails ecosystem, its GEMS ecosystem, now with all the advancements in the progressive web app ecosystem, and just a continued passion for Ruby, it's such a solid foundation to start from. And I think there's, as David mentioned in his presentation in Rails World, there's a sort of a renaissance moment going on with the one-person framework. And I think that growth is just going to continue. I think institutions like the Rails Foundation that are working to reignite some of the passion and some of the marketing efforts and some of the documentation improvements and all the stuff that Amanda talked about are getting a head start on catapulting Rails forward even more. The work that the Rails core team does, again, it's an amazing amount of work to keep such a solid foundation growing and growing, maintaining the upgradability of the systems and staying solid and allowing companies like Shopify and others to scale to enormous volumes, something that everyone would have agreed at like Rails 1.06 that would have never happened, right? So I think the growth will continue. 5 to 10 years is hard to say, but I think one thing I love about Rails since day one is its simplicity and its convention over configuration, right? One person can start an app today and have something working in a couple weeks. So I'm a true believer. It's going to take a lot to dissuade me from using Rails for pretty much everything. Yeah.
Amanda, Radamaze asks, what is the future of I know you showed us the Rails guides, but can you talk a little bit more about the future of the Rails documentation?
Yeah, sure. So right now we have a team put together. with the support of Carlos Antonio da Silva from the core team, he's auditing the whole website, and Patrick DeHoos from the issues team. They're auditing the website and going through every single documentation to see where the gaps are. Is it up to date? Are the examples relevant? Does it make sense? And by the end of this has been the focus of the year so far. By the end of this, every single documentation would have been looked at with a fine-tooth comb. And we have two writers, Bhumi Shah and Ridwana Khan, who do the writing and the editing. And then we share it amongst the team. The developers check it for technical content. I check it for ease of readability for a beginner. Is it easy to understand? Is the context there? And then what we do is we push a PR to the Rails repo for community input. So if anybody's interested in that, actually Mateus, thank you so much. He's been inputting a lot in that, so it was really nice to meet him here in site. And so if you're interested in that, keep an eye on the Rails Foundation tag in the repo, because every week we're pushing a new guide live. So next would be new guides that aren't written yet. So I'm open for suggestions there as well, and then we'll add it to the suggestions list, and if Carlos thinks that it makes sense, we'll put the writing team on it. So that's kind of like the first two steps, and then we'll see where we go from there.
That's wonderful. I know that one of the things that it's kind of interesting as Rails developers, when we encounter an issue, when we're like when we've got a bug or something, we're trying to figure something out, and so we might, pop in an error message into our search browser, and then we hit Google, and then one of the things that they've been talking about is that the Ruby on Rails documentation doesn't necessarily show up at the top of, like, you say, a Google search result, and that is an SEO problem that the foundation is trying to think about and try to get more strategic about, because it was just developed by a bunch of developers and oh yeah, here's the documentation, but then you've got other sites that have been outdated for a while showing up ahead, and that's probably not great for a Rails developer's experience to be like, this is old and outdated from Rails 5. Where to get the new Rails Edge stuff? So I know that's something that they're talking a lot about and trying to figure out. So if you have ideas and suggestions and you're an SEO wizard in your previous career, you should definitely help contribute to that.
One thing I want to add is that I think when we were looking for an executive director, because you mentioned one thing that made me think about this, and you just mentioned another thing. It's easy to write documentation that is correct, but hard to comprehend. And you talked about the fact that you're reading for readability and ease of understanding, ease of use. When we were looking for a director for the foundation, it was almost like perfect timing, because you had recently graduated from Lewagen, right? So you were technically a up-and-coming junior software engineer who did Rails at Lewagen. So I think it's important to recognize how important that is as the foundation's mission, to have someone who sees it as a newcomer into the community and who's learning the practice as well, because it's easy to make things hard to understand for beginners, and we want to grow the community. So having it easy to understand and comprehend for beginners is a huge selling point. And yeah, so thank you for accepting.
Thank you very much.
Your performance review is going really well so far.
Yeah, I think I'm in it. Time to ask for a raise.
Did you hear, DHH, if you're listening? I guess that would be a decision for the board, though, right? So we can just advocate for all the board. So talk to the sponsors, at them. Thank you, foundation board members, give her a raise. Amanda, Matthias asks, if the Rails Foundation got more sponsoring companies to support the foundation, aside from just all the ones that are already up on that list earlier, what initiatives could that extra money go to?
It's a nice thing to think about, for sure. More money is always great. I would really like to start an education grant for people who want to learn Rails, which could also support the boot camps who still use and teach Rails. And I think that's a twofold win, because I think if we lose, if boot camps decide to stop teaching Rails, I think we'll be in a very bad position. And we want people to learn Rails. We want people to be introduced to Rails and fall in love with Rails and love building with Rails. So I think that's what we would do, an education grant and supporting all the boot camps who are still using Rails, like Lewagen.
There was a time, I don't remember the exact year, but I remember having lunch with my business partner, and we were like, we're not going to be able to hire any more Rails people because there weren't enough people joining the Ruby on Rails community. And this was probably, I want to say 13 years ago, give or take. And we knew that there were some other companies moving into the city I lived in. Back then, we were all in the same office. So I know all of the Ruby developers in my city, you know, and so I hired the ones that would tolerate working with me, and I knew who else. And Airbnb was opening up an office there, and I remember thinking, there's no way I can compete with Airbnb if they're going to be hiring Rails developers in our city. And then a boot camp opened up, and they focused on Ruby on Rails. And then all of a sudden, we had a pipeline of people coming right out. So we could do internships, and then sometimes we'd hire people, and that was just an amazing, that kind of saved my company, I think, in a lot of ways. And so for people that are, I know boot camps have struggled through the pandemic and the last year in particular. So if I don't want to discourage people from starting a boot camp right now, but I do think it's important that we have these this sort of curriculum. And if your company uses Rails, you know, but if juniors are not getting hired out of boot camps, then the boot camps don't have an incentive to keep using Rails because they're afraid that they're not going to help people get jobs, because that's what they're trying to promise is like, if you spend the next 6 to 9 months learning Rails, you'll get hired. But if the companies aren't hiring junior people, it's kind of like it's not in their best interest. They're going to pick a different tech stack, and that ruins our life because we want to work with Ruby on Rails. So it's kind of like this whole, it's all connected. That's what I'm trying to say. Bruno. Lazaro asks, what arguments can employees use to convince their boss to migrate to Rails?
Just say, otherwise I quit. Well, so that's tough because I think it's less about Rails and more about value, right? As an employee, what you're paid to do is to provide value and to solve a problem for your employer. So you have to present the argument from that perspective. You know, you want me to provide you value, you want me to solve your problem. I think I can do it better, more easily, more quickly, more efficiently using Rails. So it really comes down to selling that. Like, use the tool that's right for the job that helps the employer achieve what they're needing. Practically speaking, I think the best route is probably to look at business comparables and say, look, you're trying to do this, look at this other company, they're doing it faster with fewer people, right? And then I think the Hail Mary would be do it at night and bring it ready and say, look how far I've gotten on this small one feature example that we were gonna do it in Java and whatever. And that will go a long way. Like, so put the best foot forward and show something of value and focus on the value rather than on the technology itself.
Having working code like early and be able to show that, it's kind of exciting for people at companies, especially if you're trying to disrupt everything in your organization like that. I've worked on so many projects over the years. I work in consulting, and so many of my clients, especially a long time ago, they're like, I don't even know what Ruby on Rails is. Just, the developer just picked it. You know, and they're like, so they're like, can you help us with this project? And so a lot of companies, back then it used to be really difficult 19, 20 years ago to convince people like, well, it's too new. Rails is too new, it's not gonna work. I can't find anyone. And 20 years later, now we're having conversations like, no, it's still great. We wanna keep doing this. And so it's interesting now to be on the other side of being like the 20 years into the process when we used to be fighting like the Java that had been around for like a decade, and you used to think, no, that's old, and Rails is now like 20, and it's still new and hip, I promise you, but
yeah, I mean, I have to make these decisions on a day-to-day basis. It's the first thing I look for is stability of the thing, right? The framework, the language, the community, and so if it's too new, it can be a little bit scary. But to me, what's more scarier is if it's unstable, right? So we're kind of in the middle of a Nux 3 upgrade, and that is extremely painful. From Nux 2 to Nux 3 made a lot of breaking changes. I don't want to talk a lot of trash about Nuxt, but whatever. But it's really painful, and I haven't been through a Rails upgrade that painful ever, right? And it's been many, many big leaps in Rails. So I like to look at that as well. And I think that's a selling point that you can bring to the employer and say, like, look, it's a stable framework, it's a stable language, it's maintained well, it's long-lived, it's not going anywhere, it is performant, look at these examples. Oh, and by the way, here's some working code.
Anonymous asks, how can we get more startups to pick Rails over React and other JavaScript alternatives?
I think it's pretty much the same language. Like, look for the complexity level, what you can actually produce with it with few people in a small amount of time. But it goes back to the previous answer. It's about value, right? What value can you bring to the employer? Yeah, I don't think I have a better way to convince other than just showcasing value.
Can I just a bit about that?
No. I'm not prepared for this. Robby, no, go ahead.
Or what I wanted to say is that it relates back to the messaging that I was talking about and the marketing that we're trying to do, the way we talk about it. So I think one of the biggest strengths of Rails is that it's been around for 20 years, but that's also one of the things that works against it, like you were saying. Now when you say 20 years in today's web dev world, that feels ancient. And then if for instance, the documentation look and feel hasn't been updated since 2009, then it kind of gives that impression. So if we stop talking about, is Rails dying and talking about, look how solid Rails is. Look, does Rails scale? But these are the companies that scale with Rails. So it's really about messaging and stop talking about the bad messaging and flip the script a little bit and talk about how we want Rails to be portrayed and how because you build on Rails, what the strengths are and focus more on the strengths. So I think that's one of the things as well to focus on.
This is for either of you. Robby asks, how can South and Latin America organizations help Ruby on Rails adoption in the coming years?
Okay.
This one's hard. You take it.
And how can that help people here in the room?
Yeah, well, I want to really commend the Tropical RB team and everything that they're doing right now. It's, really. Totally. You're doing an amazing job, and all of the things like highlighting the meetup folks who are driving regional meetups, the startup panel yesterday, like these are all things, the more we talk about, and the production quality of this event is really, really high. This is the look and feel of Rails that we want to put out into the world more. So I think this is where it kind of starts, this momentum, and if we can keep this going and to support communities and events like Tropical RB, this is what can start the wave that'll eventually reach throughout the rest of the world. I really believe that. So copy what they're doing.
Thank you. Another question for you, Bruno. It's a little bit related, but Piogenes asked, a considerable amount of tech companies are migrating away from Ruby to focus on Node.js and go back-end implementations. Do you think we can revert that?
I don't know that a revert makes sense. I think a lot of the good companies are realizing what tool was best for the job, and I think we should just let that be and focus on the jobs that can most benefit from Rails and Ruby. It's similar to the previous questions. It's less about pushing it down someone's throat and more about focusing on the right tool for the job. We use Go at Doximity for certain things, and we integrate well with Rails and the rest of our stack, and I think that's perfectly acceptable. So knowing multiple languages is also a huge benefit to the engineers, to the team. You do have to worry about the complexity of the stack and how you integrate everything and how you test across and integrate, but I think it's less about being dogmatic about Rails and Ruby only and more about picking the right tool for the job. I'm not a big believer in just pushing for reverting back to what you believe is right, unless that's, of course, what's right for the business. So I would just focus on using the right tool for the job at that point.
I think one of the subtext I feel like of this question is you'll see a tweet or a post on somewhere or a blog post about how companies switched from X to Y and it solved all their problems. Twitter used to use Rails and they had fail whales and then they switched away and everything's way better now. But I think there's back to the messaging part of it. There's a lot of companies that choose to stick with Ruby on Rails, and they might have complicated things that they work through, and they solve that, but they may not be telling that story. and talking about it. And I think we need to have those conversations get highlighted as well. And so if you have stories like that, you should share that. Like, why do you, like every year, like why are you continuing to use Ruby on Rails for this? Like, are you, because you might actually want to migrate to something different. Like maybe, like you meant, like the Ruby on Rails website itself. It's a static website. Maybe you don't need to use Ruby on Rails to build a web page with a couple of pages, and it's like a little overkill. Maybe it's good for you as like a hobbyist to try to figure that out. But if we just need to throw up a couple static pages, do we need a database for that? Could it just be some static files? So you have to kind of like pick the right tool for the right job. But yes, share your stories. That's going to be helpful. And then Amanda will be happy to retweet you, I'm sure. And then I can help you with the recruiting as well. Amanda, Anonymous asks, how do we keep the Rails job environment open for beginners? I feel like we kind of touched on this a little bit, but.
Yeah, specifically for beginners. That is a hard one. It's kind of referring back to that first question where it's creating space, and you hire juniors, don't you? You had a job up. Yeah. Then I think this is a great question for you.
Yeah, it depends on the job market, to be honest, right? I think the last few years we had a really hot job market, so it was really hard to hire experienced engineers. We also, if you look back a few years before then, we had a lot more boot camps that were focusing on Rails, which helps because you just have a higher throughput of people graduating. I think it's a difficult question to solve, but it shouldn't prevent people from getting into it, getting better at it, working on open source, having a bit of a portfolio of sorts to show. Because when the opportunities do come up, and the market's going to shift up and down, but when they do come up, you want to be ready, right? So I forget who it was, but they were telling a story about, I want to hire junior. I want junior people to participate in this program, and it's okay if they don't know Rails. And they said, come back a couple weeks later for an interview, and they came back and they said, okay, do you know anything about Rails? And they said, no, not really. And like, well, didn't you look it up? Didn't you learn at least a few things about it? So you want to show a lot of interest. You want to show that you've put some time into it. And I think the opportunities do come up, maybe not as often as they did 2 years ago, and hopefully not as often as they will in a couple of years, but you want to be ready for it. I think Bernardo this morning, if I'm not mistaken, had a slide showing the creation of a gem by David, right? And all the commits and the fact that it happened in a short amount of time. Like, nothing prevents a junior developer from creating something that maybe no one will use, but it'll give you great experience. And if you can go into an interview that maybe it's slightly above your current experience, but say, you know what, I haven't done a ton of Rails, I haven't done a ton of Ruby, but here's a little gem I created. Like, that will put you way ahead of all the other candidates that just sort of took the boot camp but didn't create anything, don't have any working code to show for. Even if it's not great working code, it's totally fine.
I think that's really good advice. Whenever we're interviewing for junior people or talking to interns, I'll like, let's look up your GitHub repositories a little bit, and I'll be like, all right, the first thing I notice, your Git commit messages look like they're written by someone that doesn't work with other people. Like, and we all do it, like bug fix, whatever, just WIP. And if all your commit messages are just these like one word, you're just pushing it up. We notice that when we're looking over your things. So if you're working on your own project and you're doing it in the public, think about what you're writing and make it useful for yourself in the future. One, that's the point of a commit message. We're going a little bit off on a tangent here, but circling around. But also, if you have feature ideas, throw them in your little issue list. Like, organize the project, show that you have project management experience. Those are also things that we're looking for when we're looking to hire a junior developer, any developer. It's like having those other skill sets.
Well, and then network, right? Yeah. Go to events, talk to people, because you may be junior and they may not have a rec open for you, but they might know someone who's looking. They might actually be totally fine working with you once they've met you and they know how interested, how passionate you are about working in Rails. So that stuff doesn't come through when you apply online, but it does come through in person. So if you go to the events and you talk to a lot of people, your chances are going to be way higher.
Amanda Anderson asks, is there any initiative to encourage the creation of content about Ruby on Rails?
I would love to see more content about Rails. I think one of the best things that I see in the community, and there's a couple people who do it really, really well. On Twitter, Avi Flombaum, avi.nyc. He is passionate about what he creates. He shows how easy it is to create with Rails, and he's building in public. And I would love, love, love to see more of that. So if anybody has projects, if there's anything that you can share, just be more public with it and show other people what you're doing. And that's, again, relating back to the messaging of show how much you enjoy working with Rails, and other people will see that. So I haven't gotten yet to like how to encourage that, but I would love to see it and retweet it and reshare it or whatever platform, and eventually create more content, of course, for Rails on YouTube and things like that. So yeah, we're gonna do that.
I just also want to make a quick plug. I met some individuals that are here in Brazil that have the first, I believe, to my knowledge, first Ruby on Rails podcast in Portuguese. It's the Bullet Rails podcast. So you should listen to that. All right. I'm actually curious, is the Rails Foundation thinking a lot about internationalization with documentation and content in other languages, and like how important is that to the mission, or is that maybe sometime down the road type of thing you're going to focus more on?
I was actually thinking of that when it comes to all the talks that are being recorded in Portuguese now. I think this is really another really important thing that the Tropical RB is doing. I think I don't know, you would know this better, but to see other companies in Brazil and content being created in Portuguese, is that something that you like to see, or do you prefer to see English content from abroad? I guess that's the hard question to answer when there's a couple hundred people looking at you. But does anybody have opinions on that? Which would you prefer?
Portuguese.
Nice.
I have a lot of interns that doesn't really know how to read well. This is a really good help for them, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, perfect. And I'll talk during that. She didn't see you coming.
I prefer in Portuguese. Em português, Diego.
Question from our audience? No.
Ei,
Não, eu tenho uma dúvida.
pode perguntar em português.
É o seguinte, a questão da barreira linguística, mas é por isso que eu estou falando em português agora. Se a gente acessa o Rails Guides, por exemplo, ele é todo em inglês, e eu sinto que algumas pessoas têm essa dificuldade, principalmente em países como o Brasil e alguns outros da América Latina, talvez outros países. Existe algum esforço por parte da fundação em tornar isso mais acessível para essas pessoas? Eu sei que tem um trabalho aí do pessoal da Campus Code de tradução, mas existe alguma proposta ou está se pensando nesse aspecto de fazer essa integração e tradução para dentro da linguagem ou para dentro dos guias?
The question is, would you consider translating the guides to Portuguese and other languages?
I think it would be a hard thing to translate all of the guides, because then there's several languages that we would do that in, and then you'd have to, every time there's an update, go back to all of the languages. But I believe we do have localization on the guides. I'm looking over at the core team. Does anybody know? I think we did some localization. At least there was, we were talking to, yeah, we definitely do have it, because we have right to left language capability. So I think it is on the guides already, but if that's not clear, then I have to work on that, maybe. But it's not like a drop-down version checker or anything like that.
Maybe someday. We'll come back to that.
But also like the importance of content created, the podcast, all the videos that are recorded for this, and telling stories from Brazilian companies who are successful with Rails. This is all really important, and it doesn't necessarily have to come from the foundation. It can come from things like Tropical RB.
Awesome. Well, we're getting a little alert that our time is up. I want to take a moment to say thank you to Amanda and to Bruno. Give them a round of applause. Thank you for their contributions and helping us with the community. Thank you. Enjoy your afternoon sessions.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.